Actually, Malcolm said, always been my older brother.
Yeah.
Brian is his own character, very
Malcolm
strong.
Young, the silent man in charge of yells that he never pursued fame. Never yearned for the spotlight, but he was the gravitational attraction at a device known as. After over 50 years of acdc, he stood unaffected by the glare behind the guitar stardom that was solely fueled by riffs that were straightforward, steady, and solid like a heartbeat. He created music in this manner, and he alive. But concealed behind that perseverance was a there were nights, but few people ever witnessed. The darkness. He was unable to recall his riffs. Written demonstrates the areas he needed to relearn. Tunes like a young child just beginning, and during his last years as his body despite being betrayed, Malcolm continued to fight. Must maintain his equilibrium, not for himself, but serving a higher purpose, the dignity of he didn't bow to the band that hadn't depart acdc with a declaration that he just disappeared as silently as he had kept the group together over the years. A legend cannot endure without a beating heart. Malcolm Young's heartbeat was rough. Rock and roll's silent, irreplaceable empire, and once he vanished, no, the world never did an encore. Genuinely comprehend his early self. Young, Malcolm Mitchell, was born on Glasgow, Scotland on January 6, 1953 in the center of a desolate industrial metropolis where unemployment and chilly winds permeated the youth's enter each red brick house. 8 children were squeezed into the family. His father moved into a tiny apartment in Cranhill. Before, William worked as a flight engineer in World War II, who subsequently worked in his mother worked in construction and as a mailman. As a housewife, Margaret carried the weight of a big family at a certain moment while Britain was still having trouble. Scenes from Malcolm's early years during the war lacked art schools and expensive instruments. Just the radio's crackling voice portraying Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, and these far-off American noises cast shadows. Diffused via the moist walls of working-class life in Scotland for young children, music was a reality, not a fantasy. George, the oldest brother, was the refugee. First to make that haven a reality escape, he became successful with the group. His younger self departed the easy beats. Siblings with an unnecessary message, phrases that you could leave this place if you performed adequately in the Glasgow snow accumulated because the winter was so severe. Outside their door, a metre high, the young family chose to depart in pursuit of Australians' glimmering hope, government, a fresh start, warmer temperatures, and the opportunity to begin once more. Malcolm was just 10 when he departed Scotland, with the exception of 2 older siblings who remained in when they got to Sydney from Europe. They were transported straight to a temporary Villawood, a camp for immigrants, Nissan, surrounded by corrugated metal in the summer. Huts are cold and blistering hot. Cold at night, and all they had was mutually, but even in that absence, the music never stopped playing in their first Australia's nighttime. Malcolm and his sitting on concrete floors, brothers passed learning chords by an ancient guitar from George before instructing Angus. The children in a noisy home didn't quarrel over toys, arguing over who received to play the guitar. Malcolm wasn't the loudest kid at beginning. He wasn't as crazy as Angus in the house. Not as nimble as George, yet he possessed perseverance, a silent determination that would eventually turn into the irreplaceable the basis of while his brothers aspired to be famous. CDC Malcolm concentrated on the beat, rhythm, and listened to a migrant's vital signs. Malcolm Young, a child living in a metal shack, was surrounded by broken guitars growing up. Strings as well as the cheap, chaotic atmosphere of working-class neighborhoods. However, it came from those overlooked areas. That a mood of music emerged, not hard like steel, but polished rather than lyrical, sincere as dirt and strong as alternating current that is somewhat constant, and early career extinction is impossible. The musical was not started by Malcolm Young. Go on fiery stages or with contracts worth millions of dollars. It started in a claustrophobic home in the Sydney suburbs where vintage guitars were strewn all over the cacophony of a packed immigrant household. There, house music wasn't just a dream. was an adolescent survival instinct. Malcolm was a member of several local bands, but the first significant tipping point occurred when he and Angus joined in the early 1970s. A side project is the Marcus Hook Roll Band. George Young, their older brother, is in charge. Harry Vanda, the band's collaborator. Tales of Old Grandaddy is the only album. Had little effect on commerce, but it marked the first occasion that Malcolm and Angus performed in a studio together. Malcolm's gains there weren't technical, the music was philosophical. Ought to be unvarnished, honest, and Malcolm, never pretend at the same time. Additionally performed on Stevie Wright's Evie is an 11-minute rock epic with multiple parts. His harsh, scorching solo on the song stood in stark contrast to the reserved manner, which he would eventually embrace. Was a time of trial and error, but also one in which Malcolm started to understand that he didn't really want to flaunt himself. In 1973, it was something more profound. Choose to form a new band with Angus. Project that is fiery and unyielding, in contrast to pop music's glossy and flamboyant dominant scene. The name the voltage sign on the acdc, their sister's basic sewing machine, strong and entirely consistent with Malcolm's vision, is straightforward and unambiguous. Frills from Malcolm's first pub appearances on the conductor's involvement in the shadows. He didn't wear the frontman's uniform. Dressed like an Angus schoolboy and didn't interact with the audience, but he established the tempo, adjusted each pause, and served as the initially able to determine whether the drummer missed a. He was the technical player from the beginning. The brain of acdc, despite being in the rear at acdc, was still a tiny band at that time. Rotating members while moving through the vocalists and performing in spaces that hardly have room for a few dozen individuals, but even in those initial Malcolm sowed the seed of what would become the distinctive characteristic of the band: no lengthy solos, no heartfelt ballads, rock, just rhythm, just special effects did more than create a band. He established a method of having a career breakthrough following Malcolm Young founded the band acdc in 1973. Didn't chase big shots or dash into studios. Steps rather than lying down for a long time. The basis from enlisting participants and experimenting with lineups to mold the raw, unwavering sound that he imagined. He met singer Bon Scott in 1974. Older than the majority of rock stars at the time, yet with an untamed, hoarse tone and a Malcolm's way of life, which complemented the music, wanted to make it, and it was quick. Prior to Malcolm substituting Dave Evans with Bon, and acdc really got their start from sweaty evenings spent performing in Sydney, and the band rapidly improved in Melbourne pubs. The live wire on its identify was Angus. The hard-drinking cowboy, Bon, who shouted into the microphone, but Malcolm was there. Who prevented the machine from going off course? Of course, he composed the tunes that influenced their, supervised the sound, and provided structure in 1975. High Voltage was their debut release in a series of historic albums where Malcolm was the silent force that propelled it. Unlike most rhythm guitarists, Malcolm was cast in the background. Created all of the engine's riffs. Were the entry points strong? But just as powerful as a stomach punch, there is still a long way to go before reaching the top. The child's rock problem started with his raw, stripped-down music that is matched to the beat without using ostentatious methods. He transformed self-control into a lethal weapon, and he served as the studio's final judge. If a song had an acdc vibe, or Malcolm didn't adhere to fashions when he clung to classic glam rock. When punk exploded, he was a rock and roll grit, didn't alter the tempo to appease the audience. During the metal-heavy 1980s, he maintained his open chords were played using a low-gain amplifier. No solos or pedals, just rhythm rather than limiting him. The guitar made his unshakable vision is what makes acdc special. Helped the band go far beyond Australia and Europe and America, from Powerage to Let There Be Rock in 1977-1978. With every record, acdc became more acute. In addition to dominating the stage, the studio as well, where Malcolm is in 1979, Highway arrived with The Unseen Captain. Their first album with a producer, to Helmut Lang, who improved the sound quality of their studio. However, Malcolm was still the one who sculpted the musical structure. The record turned into a worldwide triumph, making AC/DC a real rock phenomenon, which started with Malcolm Young, the man behind the scenes. Despite his accomplishments, he never achieved the goal of being in the spotlight. His rhythm roll was unbroken by the microphone. Because he recognized that a machine could run efficiently, someone needed to maintain a steady hand firmly and silently on the wheel, and Malcolm never missed a beat. That man was young, unobtrusive, and quiet. But completely the addiction to darkness is irreplaceable. Battling and acting as like nothing is wrong. It's possible that Malcolm Young kept up with the accuracy of a Swiss timepiece, but for almost 40 years, there was no machine. He maintained AC/DC's integrity. However, the same resilience and feeling of obligation to gradually keep everything together weakened him from the inside out. Surface stability was insufficient to conceal, and Malcolm had descended into his deeper truth. When AC/DC was in the dark in 1988, in the midst of your video tour's explosion, Malcolm quietly moved aside, avoiding the media. Scandal. Without making a formal remark, the band referred to it as a brief pause, but in actuality, Malcolm had reached his lowest point. Alcoholic, a man who had previously regulated everything could no longer self-control. Performances turned into he played the same well-known song in pain. Riffs, but his thoughts were vacant, and for Malcolm Young's initial need to acknowledge that he was disintegrating later, he admitted in the interview, "It caught up, I got lost with me." Angus he had previously carried a younger brother who he confronted the first person to observe. Straight out, "I don't want to see you suffer," similar to Bon Scott. Consequently, Malcolm entered rehabilitation for his nephew. Stevie Young took over on rhythm guitar for a short while. AC/DC continued to run during the tour. Blazing, nevertheless, Malcolm was aware that this was he had to confront the fact that he had no studio. No audience, no longer motivation to perform, just him as well as the cracks that were left following years of self-sacrifice for the band. Upon his recovery from addiction, Malcolm made a triumphant comeback with the Razor's Edge 1990, a resurgence distinguished by the Thunderstruck was hit by an explosion, but everyone that he had returned from the Edge, and none ever came back with nearly the still. The internal conflicts didn't disappear as the main lyricist and co-founder and the band. Malcolm's musical essence constantly existed under the shadow of Angus. The public representation of the media praised Angus as a genius in AC/DC. A rock star, but Malcolm said nothing. Quantified and invisible people thought he didn't give a damn, yet he once had a rare talk with Angus. "You're the face, I'm the spine." It's for a band, it wasn't bitterness but the reality. Someone has to keep quiet in order to spark the fire burning brightly. In his last years, as his memory started to deteriorate due to dementia, and Malcolm maintained his cool while playing even when he needed to relearn songs that he had written despite his difficulties backstage. To conceal the fear in his gaze, and when he stepped because he could no longer conceal it. Later, Angus, "Go away this time for good," remembered that Malcolm had once said to him, "I had to act as though you're continuing for the band for everyone, including you." He wasn't while feigning to play, he continued to play with blood and flesh, but he was acting as though remain resilient so that you can stay in control when he was silently within. Falling apart wasn't a sign of weakness. Was an uncommon form of bravery that professes not to be dishonest but to prevent the things you love from shattering. Malcolm Young's music was more than just music. Was a pledge, and he fulfilled it. Malcolm Young's health decline, expenses conquered booze, he once feigned continue even as his recollection started to diminish even with every guitar strum. became increasingly tense. He continued to hold the rhythm together, yet one day the body was no longer able to mimic the sickness. Wasn't raucous or aggressive like an accident, but it caused deeper destruction. More sluggish, quiet, and unrelenting. The initial signs of dementia appeared in 2008, as acdc got ready for the Angus from the Black Ice album remembered that Malcolm began to lose track of his riffs. Wrote himself having to perform just one saying dozens of times to help you remember it, but he continued, saying, "Just do it, I'm alright." The Black Ice World Tour continued for 3 years and almost one of the most successful tours throughout the history of acdc, but it was a race against his will for Malcolm. Each night's receding recollection was a struggle to remember the songs he has performed countless times. Occasionally just a few hours prior to taking the stage, he would ultimately recall the first riff in Hell's Shoot to Thrill or Bells, and he still went outside while still standing under the lights. In addition, Angus continued to hit that initial chord as if nothing had gone wrong. Following that his condition quickly deteriorated, physicians determined that he had dementia brought on by initially, neurodegeneration went the first short-term memory, followed by long-term. Malcolm eventually lost the riffs as well. That had turned into legendary acdc songs and ultimately, even his family, the most familiar faces, vanished into vague shards of a disappearing past. The band declared in writing that Malcolm Young would put an end to acdc permanently. Pretending that there is no more stage, a musical prodigy who played the guitar withdrew into quiet, as he had always opted to remain in the background, which is far worse. Malcolm's struggle with dementia wasn't the only one. Additionally experienced lung cancer and had a heart disease-related pacemaker implantation. The identical body that had remained unfazed on stage for many years had turned into a battlefield for low-key conflicts, but one something never left him. Angus's interpretation of music: whenever he came and performed a vintage riff on the Malcolm's guitar, even if he couldn't recall the song's name, would tap. Sometimes his foot smiles, and other times it just sit quietly and pay attention while your mind. His heart was broken, but it was still attached to each and every sound of Malcolm. acdc. On November 18, 2017, Young died at the age of 64. With family all around, no sirens, flashing lights, and a prolonged period of quiet, such as he once performed a few words of music, but extravaganza, but completely irreplaceable, and his death was an agonizing rock symphony's low note that had endured for more than 40 years, a genius who never aimed for attention but was in charge of constant light for the whole band for a whole generation, and at last, that light left silently saying goodbye in November. The rock world shuddered on the 18th of 2017 when word spread that Malcolm Young had died. There were no dramatic headlines, no big goodbye. He departed from this world unchanged. The manner in which he had lived in silence but leaving a gap that no one could ever fill. The loss of acdc wasn't the only thing that happened. Loss of a musical school of thought, philosophy, as well as everyone who thought you didn't require attention to be incredibly wonderful. His funeral took place at St. Sidney's Mary's Cathedral, where family, hundreds of fans, bandmates, and friends assembled to pay serious homage to a Gibson. The guitar was reverently positioned at the top. The flower-covered coffin is a representation of an artist who transformed basic wires into Ulrich Metallica's Something Eternal. Eddie Van Halen meet death. Dave Mustaine AZ. Billy Idol is kissed by Osbourne/Paul Stanley, and including those hitherto viewed as competitors in the everyone in the rock industry spoke up, but nobody spoke. Nobody brought up money when discussing showmanship or the rankings of the charts. They mentioned Malcolm has a solid rhythm, strumming the pulse like a heartbeat that prevented an empire from. He didn't need to say much, he collapsed. He let the guitar speak for him. Someone uttered the brief phrase, everything, in a really sentimental declaration. I can't believe, wrote Brian Johnson. Malcolm is no longer with us, but we had a terrific time. He was a real genius all by himself. Yet he never appreciated becoming famous, but he never asked for thanks. simply wanted to perform it correctly, and he did till he was unable to. Roses and Additional Firearms are on tour at the time. Devoted to their performance of Calling Malcolm Foo's Heavenly Door. Let There Be Rock was covered by Fighters using a voice that sounded like it was breaking from the AC/DC inspired heart bands all around from the US, UK, Germany, Japan, and Australia together paid respects in an unusual occasion when the whole rock world turned into one household, but maybe nobody saw the greater depth of loss than Angus Young. A lifetime next to one another from the smallest Burwood room to the largest phases, starting with their initial chords to their last riffs, and now there's just one left. In an emotional 60-minute interview, Angus from Australia stated, "It's not though the hardest part of saying goodbye is observing his gradual decline while his recollection was no longer his own." Power Up 2020 is an album composed of riffs Malcolm had penned and documented in prior years are considered to be ACE/DC's last. A letter of affection to their departed co-founder Young is given credit for each song. Reminder that despite Malcolm's lack of, he continues to live on in every no farewell could match the band's heartbeat. Never adequately convey what Malcolm Young intended, but perhaps none is required because each time back in's opening riff Black screams to life or the obvious in his life, the beat of high voltage kicks once more, not only in recollection but in the he made a sound that lasted the whole. Malcolm Young's global legacy and influence was not the kind of artist to possess sculptures built in his likeness or in his honor printed everywhere on t-shirt store, but to people who know rock particularly. Genuine rock, where each note the marrow must be the source, not a plug-in. Even in death, Malcolm is a living legend. He didn't jump across the bridge alone. Stage didn't provide lengthy remarks or control the attention, but the manner in which he remained motionless, strumming a chord after chord with almost flawless accuracy for more than 40 years established the groundwork for the distinct sound of AC/DC. Is so honest, dense, robust, and gritty. Malcolm hardly needed any effects.